The blood of Israel, whispering through Indian veins, but never written in a single baptismal record. It wasn't supposed to be there, because everything about the Roman Catholics of Goa says otherwise. The crucifix, the Latin prayers, the Portuguese surnames, all signs of a faith transplanted by the empire. But in 2021, when scientists peered into the double helix, the illusion cracked. A landmark genetic study published in Human Genetics analysed the DNA of 110 Catholics from Goa, Kumta and Mangalore, and what it revealed was a paradox no priest could have foreseen. Their paternal lines carried R1A, the signature of North Indian Brahmins, the ancient priestly caste, Indo-European, dominant, scholarly. These were the men who once chanted the Vedas, now remembered only in Latin liturgy. Meanwhile, the maternal line, mtDNA, showed Aboriginal Indian roots. Mothers of this community for thousands of years had never crossed the seas. They were of the land, daughters of the subcontinent. Together these lineages paint a precise story. Local women and high caste Brahmin men, converted, perhaps forcibly, under Portuguese rule after 1510. This is not a theory. It's not family law. It's coded in biology. The faith was reborn. But the blood was never erased. Visual irony echoes everywhere. Cathedrals in old Goa, like the Basilica of Bom Jesus, built on temple ruins. Stones once sanctified by Hindu chants now house statues of saints. But the children sitting in the pews? They are descendants of those same Brahmins who once ruled those temples. Inversion, rebirth, silence. And then came the anomaly, a shadow in the genome, a signal no one expected. Buried not in the temple nor the church, but in the DNA Jewish admixture, detected through linkage disequilibrium analysis, a genetic fingerprint not found in other Indo-European populations nearby. Unique, unexplained, until now unspoken. So now the question expands. How did the blood of Sephardic Jews find its way into the coastal Catholics of India? To find that answer, we must step into fire. Not metaphorical, literal. The flames of the Goan Inquisition, where identity was burned, and yet, somehow, survived. It began in 1560, sanctioned by the Portuguese crown, fuelled by the Catholic Church, and enforced by iron and ash. For over 250 years, it scorched the Konkan coast, silencing Hindus, Muslims and Jews who resisted conversion. Temples were razed, sacred texts burned, bodies tortured, exiled, broken. But something survived. Because when scientists in 2021 ran a deep genomic analysis, mapping the uniparental and autosomal markers of 110 Catholics from Goa, Kumta and Mangalore, they found a whisper that had no place in the records. A Jewish signal, clear, isolated, unshared by other local Indo-European populations, detected through linkage disequilibrium-based admixture analysis. A technique that measures inherited genetic blocks. It wasn't just coincidence, it was a legacy. But how did Sephardic Jewish ancestry end up buried inside Indian Catholic bodies? For that, we have to look 5,000 miles west, to the Iberian Peninsula. In 1492, Spain issued the Alhambra Decree. All Jews must convert to Catholicism, or be expelled. Portugal followed suit in 1497. But some who converted, the conversos, kept their faith in secret. By 1510, the Portuguese had landed in Goa, and along with soldiers and missionaries came merchants, bureaucrats, and crypto-Jews fleeing persecution in Europe. Some hid in plain sight. Others married into local Brahmin converts, whose own identities had been cracked by force. Two displaced lineages, two ancient traumas, now fused in the DNA of modern Catholics. No synagogue survived in Goa. But the genes did, and the customs, they lingered. Families lighting candles on Friday night without knowing why. Avoiding pork, long after Hinduism or Judaism faded from memory. Washing the dead in silence. Rituals remembered by the body, but forgotten by the mind. This wasn't folklore. This was genetic fact, traced, mapped, published, a scientific echo of an erased community. But this raises a deeper question. Why did these Jewish genes only appear in Catholics? Why not in local Hindus? Why not in Muslim traders or isolated Brahmin lineages? Because the fire was selective. The conversions weren't random. They were targeted, strategic, brutal. To understand why Jewish blood flowed into Catholic veins, and nowhere else, we have to enter the eye of the storm. Not the ship, not the church, but the courtroom of the Holy Office, where names were changed, languages lost, and history rewritten by force. Because the next chapter is not about survival, it's about erasure, and what happens when identity becomes a sentence, punishable by death, not in exile, not in silence, but in bloodlines that wore the cross, while hiding the scars. Because the Inquisition in Goa didn't just convert a population, it rewired a genome. It began on September 16th, 1560, when the first tribunal of the Holy Office landed on Indian soil, sent by the Portuguese crown, empowered by Rome, and feared by every Hindu, Muslim or Jew who refused to kneel. Its target wasn't just theology, it was identity. Entire cultures were criminalized, temples destroyed, manuscripts burned. Even speaking Konkani or performing a Hindu rite could mean torture. Over 16,000 trials were recorded before it was finally abolished, not by mercy but by force, in 1812. And during those 252 years, the population changed. Because when scientists analysed the DNA of Goan, Kumta and Mangalorean Catholics in 2021, they found more than Brahmin and Jewish ancestry. They found a collapse, a population bottleneck, a severe one, perfectly timed with the peak brutality of the Inquisition. The genetic record shows a sudden drop in male line diversity, followed by centuries of endogamy and social sealing. This wasn't just conversion, it was a demographic trauma. Entire male lines extinguished. Others absorbed under the mask of new faith, given Portuguese names, baptized en masse, and married into convert families. The scientific term is founder effect, when a small remnant becomes the entire future. But in Goa, the founders weren't chosen, they were survivors. The Jewish signal detected, so rare, so unique, wasn't spread by migration. It was locked into place by genocide, a final flash of admixture before the doors slammed shut. The Holy Office wanted obedience. What they got was a cryptic genetic archive, where Hindu women, Brahmin fathers, and Sephardic refugees all became Catholics, under the gaze of the confessor's chair. And that genetic paradox still pulses 5 centuries later. A Catholic community with Indo-European priesthood markers and Middle Eastern Jewish ancestry, carved by fire, preserved by silence, revealed only now in the code. But if Goa's Catholic genome was built on persecution, what about the very people who created the Inquisition, the land that gave birth to the Holy Office? Spain. Because while they burned others to purify the faith, they forgot to check their own blood. Spain, the birthplace of the Holy Office, the mother of the Inquisition, had built a machine to purify the soul. But it never purified the genome. In 2008, a study rocked the foundation of that illusion. Researchers scanned the Y chromosomes of over 1,100 men across Spain and Portugal. They expected uniformity, Catholic continuity, heritage sealed by fire. What they found was heresy, not in doctrine, in DNA. Nearly 20% of Iberian Catholic men carried Sephardic Jewish paternal lineages. Another 11% showed Moorish ancestry from North Africa. That means, on average, 1 in 3 Iberian men who believed they were descendants of old Christians were actually the sons of the expelled. The Inquisition didn't purge the heretics, it absorbed them. Conversos, Jews forced to convert after 1492. Moriscos, Muslims baptized under pressure in 1502. They stayed. They adapted. They lit candles in secret, changed surnames, married carefully, survived silently. But blood remembers. The myth of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, was never real, just a paper mask on a genetic firestorm. And the irony. Those who built the tribunals, those who signed the orders, those who watched the burnings, may have shared the exact same lineage as the ones they condemned. This wasn't a footnote, it was systemic. Sephardic Y haplogroups, like J and T, weren't isolated, they were embedded, in cities, in villages, in clergy. They became priests, bishops, knights, the line between prosecutor and persecuted, erased in the bloodstream. And yet, the silence remained. No sermon spoke of it, no liturgy acknowledged it. It lived only in whispers and in the code, until now. Because those same conversos who survived Spain's fires didn't just vanish, they fled. And when they crossed the Atlantic, they carried more than names, more than prayers. They carried the genetics of resistance. But they didn't carry it east. They carried it west, to the New World, to a land where names changed, but blood didn't. Because after Spain's fires, after the Alhambra Decree in 1492 and Portugal's in 1497, many Jews didn't run to safety. They sailed under disguise. The Crown had forbidden them from joining the expeditions. No Jew, no new Christian of recent conversion was legally allowed to enter the colonies. But history isn't built on what's legal, it's built on what survives. So they came, as doctors, merchants, bakers, priests, all with false papers, all with secrets stitched under their rosaries. They were the conversos, crypto-Jews. And they didn't just reach one country. They spread across Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile, even Brazil. Entire families, blending in by day, whispering in code by night. And in 2018, a groundbreaking study published in Nature Communications confirmed what had long been denied. More than 6,500 people were tested, across 5 countries. The result? Nearly 25% had detectable Sephardic Jewish ancestry, most with 5% or more of their genome linked to Eastern Mediterranean Jewish clusters. They were lighting candles on Friday night and didn't know why. They were avoiding pork long after the threat had passed. And in some regions, like northern Mexico and Colombia, their burial customs, food rituals, even family taboos, echoed practices from synagogues their ancestors could no longer name. Medical studies started to notice too. Genetic diseases like BRCA1, long associated with Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, began showing up in Catholic patients from Brazil, Peru, even Puerto Rico. Like a ghost of a faith their families had buried in fear. This wasn't ancestry by choice. It was survival, layered under centuries of silence. And while much of that lineage diluted through centuries of colonization, in some places, it didn't. In certain communities, endogamy kept those genetic markers almost intact. like a sealed vault, a biological time capsule. And one such vault wasn't in the heart of Latin America. It was farther north, out in the cold, on the edge of the Atlantic, a Catholic colony so isolated, its faith and bloodline remained frozen in time. While Latin America blurred faith and ancestry into one mixed silence, Newfoundland held the line. Not by choice, by separation. The Irish Catholics who landed here in the 1700s weren't just fleeing poverty or empire, they were fleeing erasure. In Ireland they'd been crushed under Protestant rule, forbidden to hold land, to teach, to pray in Latin. But on Canada's eastern edge they found a new kind of exile, a place harsh enough to keep outsiders away and familiar enough to remember who they were. They brought their saints, their songs, and something deeper, their DNA. A 2006 genetic study analysed the Y chromosomes of Catholic men in Newfoundland, and the results were chilling. Over 80% carried R1b-MM222, a marker linked to ancient Gaelic bloodlines. It's the same haplogroup found in the descendants of Irish High Kings, not diluted, not blended, preserved. And here's the twist. When those results were compared to local Protestants, often from English or Scottish settlers, the overlap was nearly zero. 300 years on the same rock. Yet two distinct genetic islands, one Catholic, one Protestant, still separate. Even in death, the boundary held, gravestones in separate cemeteries, surnames echoing the divide. O'Sullivan, Byrne, Walsh, still tracking to M222. The religious wall had vanished from law, but not from lineage, because in this icy exile, faith didn't just shape identity, it froze, locked it into a closed loop of survival, passed father to son, prayer to gene. But Ireland wasn't the only Catholic nation that layered faith over forgotten blood. Far across the continent, in the heart of Europe, another group took baptism not to preserve their faith, but to erase it. And centuries later, their descendants too would discover a past they never knew they carried, not buried in exile, but rewritten inside the heart of the church itself. But in Poland, it didn't come by sea, it came in silence. While Catholic identity froze in Newfoundland, sealed by isolation, in 18th century Poland, it was reshaped from within. It began with a man, Jacob Frank, born in 1726 in what's now Ukraine. Raised among Sabbatian mystics, he claimed visions, revelations, and eventually declared that true redemption would come through baptism. It was heresy to Jews, but to the Vatican, a miracle. Thousands followed. By 1759, in a single year, more than 26,000 Jews converted to Catholicism under Frank's movement, the Frankists. It wasn't forced, it wasn't hidden, it was orchestrated. Public baptisms, royal protection, even backing from Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, for a time. But this wasn't mass salvation, it was a mass mutation of identity. Because Frankist families didn't vanish. They married into Poland's noble Catholic houses. They climbed social ladders. Some even became clergy. But their DNA kept the ledger. Modern studies have uncovered Jewish haplogroups like J1, J2 and T2b inside Polish Catholic bloodlines, linked not to conversion under the Nazis, but to 18th century Frankist descent. And then came the war. During the Holocaust, as the SS stormed towns like Tarnów and Lviv, Jewish parents made unthinkable decisions. They placed infants into Catholic convents. Names were changed, birth dates rewritten, rosaries placed where mezuzahs once hung. Many never learned the truth. Today, in Krakow and Chicago, Warsaw and Toronto, second and third generation Polish Catholics are spitting into DNA kits and watching their world collapse. One devout grandmother discovers her maternal line leads to a rabbi in 1760. A Polish bishop uncovers mitochondrial markers linked to Białystok vanished Jewish community. None of this was taught in catechism because the church didn't erase it, it baptized it. Let time finish forgetting. But DNA doesn't forget. And while Poland's Catholicism absorbed Jewish ancestry through ideology and survival, another Catholic nation inherited its hidden bloodline through global commerce, not through fire, not through war, but through cargo holds and colonized bodies, because thousands of miles away in the Pacific, a fleet of Spanish ships was silently rewriting the genes of Asia. They came not with torches, but with sails. While Eastern Europe baptized memory in holy water, the Pacific wrote its secret history through tide and time. From 1565 to 1815, the Manila galleon trade ran like a heartbeat across oceans. A 250-year corridor between Acapulco, New Spain, and Manila, the Pearl of the Orient. Every year, once or twice, a Spanish galleon would cross 15,000 kilometers, carrying silk, spices, silver, and settlers. But some of those settlers were not Spaniards, they were mestizos, men born of indigenous Mexican mothers and Spanish fathers, classified under colonial law as castas. And while official records buried their names under the title servants or crew, genetics tells a clearer truth. They settled, they married Filipino women, they had children, and they changed the genome of a nation. In 2021, a groundbreaking genome-wide analysis revealed Native American mitochondrial DNA in modern Filipino Catholic communities, especially around Zambales, Cavite, and Manila. The markers, a 2B2C1, are classic hallmarks of indigenous ancestry from central Mexico and South America. They weren't flukes. They matched ancient lineages found in the Nahua and Zapotec regions of Oaxaca and Puebla, descended only through maternal lines. These weren't echoes. They were inheritances, passed from Mexican mothers in the 1600s to Filipino daughters in the 2000s. And still, no one talks about it. In churches built like Veracruz basilicas, under statues of Our Lady of Guadalupe, Filipinos pray in Tagalog, but in their blood is the ocean. Even their traditions whisper of this past. La Naval processions echo Mesoamerican pageantry. Miraculous Marian tales mirror Aztec goddess stories. Colonial Catholicism fused across 3 continents: Filipino, Spanish, Mexican indigenous, one faith, 3 genomes. None of it in the textbooks, because history was written by the empire. The genome was writing something else, and long before ancestry tests were trendy, someone saw it first. Not a priest, not a historian, but a scientist who cracked open the helix and found faith. Not in scripture, but in symmetry. While ships crossed oceans and DNA slipped silently between empires, a quiet man in a monastery garden was charting something just as radical. His name was Gregor Mendel, an Augustinian friar. Not a revolutionary, not a dissenter, just a man planting peas and watching. In the mid-1800s, his abbey in Brno gave him a simple task: tend the monastery gardens. But Mendel turned it into an obsession. He bred thousands of plants, recorded every trait, and through patient observation uncovered a law no church had ever written. Traits follow patterns, inheritance has rules, and identity can be traced. Mendel wasn't trying to challenge theology, he believed in the divine. But his work hinted at something the church had long resisted: that blood carries history deeper than baptism ever could. He never published in scientific journals. He never saw his work accepted in his lifetime. Yet today, every saliva test, every ancestry map, every unspoken heritage unearthed by modern genetics starts in that garden. The Church, unknowingly, had given the world the very method that would one day unwrap its most intimate truths. Because what Mendel discovered wasn't just biology, it was memory, made visible. Catholics in Mexico discovering native grandmothers, Polish priests carrying Jewish mitochondrial lines, Irish fishermen with Royal Gaelic haplotypes, preserved in frozen exile. All of it decoded by the laws Mendel first scribbled in a friar's notebook. He never left the abbey walls, but his ideas escaped, and now they haunt every quiet moment when a person opens their ancestry results and sees something unexpected. Because if our identities are written in strands, not just sacraments, then the final question isn't scientific, it's spiritual. What happens when faith meets a family tree it never prepared us for? In Goa, a Catholic woman traces her autosomal DNA and finds ancestral overlap with Chitpavan Brahmins, the same priestly caste whose temples were torn down by Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century. In Mexico City, a retired teacher receives a genetic health alert, BRCA1 mutation, most common among Ashkenazi Jews. She had no Jewish relatives, until a match leads her to a 17th century converso woman baptized in Veracruz, who arrived from Seville under a false name. In Zamość, Poland, a young seminarian uploads his raw DNA data, and it lights up with connections to Frankist descendants in Brooklyn. The name Jakubowicz sits just one generation before his great-grandfather, a known Catholic judge. And in Manila, a family with deep devotion to the Black Nazarene finds an unbroken maternal haplogroup, not from China, not from Spain, but from central Oaxaca. Mitochondrial haplogroup C1c, passed down from indigenous Mexican women aboard the galleons of the 1600s, smuggled in under colonial silence. These aren't stories of rebellion, they're stories of absorption. Catholicism didn't just baptize, it was archived. Each convert, each secret, folded into ritual, preserved in memory, carried in silence. It's why today the world's most genetically diverse religion is also the one most shaped by conversion, conquest, and contradiction. One faith, but many bloodlines, one creed, layered over thousands of genomes. And for the first time in history, the tools to reveal it aren't held by popes or kings. They're in your browser, your test kit, your cheek swab. Because the final sacrament might be knowledge. So ask yourself, if your DNA revealed an ancestor from a different faith, a rabbi, an imam, a shaman, would you feel betrayed? Or would you feel expanded? Subscribe for more untold stories of identity written in blood. Next up, the prophet's cousin in French DNA?